कोणी पडल. खुर्ची कुठे आहे तिथे? खुर्ची तर नाही ना. उभं राहून करतो राहते. आता दुष्काळाच्या 13 महिना कुठे आहे? राहू दे.
Hi, y'all.
हम्म.
So, welcome to the last part of South Asia Deconstructed, also co-joined as the Ambedkar Memorial Lecture, co-hosted by the UT Student Coalition for Caste Abolition and the Indigo Collective. This is a very special event as this is an annual series hosted by the Student Coalition ever since 2022, 2023, 2022. So, as we kind of uphold our traditions and begin in kind of the remembrance and teachings of Baba Seb, we hope you enjoyed today's speaker. Without further ado, I'm going to first talk through some of our sponsors as required, and then I'll let Vishal take it away. This event was made possible by 12 different departments who provided us funding, some of which I'll list. We have the College of Liberal Arts, the Department of English, the Center for Media Entertainment Studies, Communication Studies, Harkey Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, the Center for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and a couple more that I'm not remembering off the top of my head. Unfortunately, it'll be on the live stream. Additionally, we got additional support from the Ambedkarite Buddhists of Texas, and co-joined by the Coalition and Indigo. We hope you enjoy today's event. Vishal, take it away.
Thank you, JB Mall.
Jai Bhim.
Welcome to this evening, and I'm sorry for the mess. 15 minutes. I know it's very hard to practice patience in these present times. So I want to start little bit on an informal note. So I have two of my friends visiting. One is actually going to be a hero here, like running the show. Suraj, of course, and Deepak is visiting me from India. So Deepak asked me one question yesterday, which is a very serious question and a complex question I could not answer. And I hope Suraj is so much invested and trying hard to find the answer to that question. So Deepak asked me yesterday, Vishal, when are we going to get rid of caste? He literally asked me. And I wish caste had a expiry date, or any institution that demeans, denies, and thrives on operation of others has an expiry date, but unfortunately it does not. But we have doctors working on it. So it was Dr. Ambedkar who led the effort and wanted to annihilate caste actually. So it's not simply eradication, elimination. Annihilation is way more like radical. It's an annihilation. And to answer Deepak's question, I think one of my I read somewhere that you need a deep moral surgery of heart to get rid of such things. So Dr. Suraj Yengde is going to lead us to that journey today. How do we engage in a moral surgery of heart to get rid of all the intoxicants and or sort of institutions that continues to thrive and demon human beings and subjection. So Suraj, I think, is my friend and also a very world-renowned scholar. I don't think he needs an introduction, but a very popular book, Caste Matters, best-selling book. I think most of us have read or at least come across. He's currently associated with Harvard as a fellow, and I'm not supposed to tell this, but soon he'll be getting a new engagement in US, so it's a good news. And yeah, he's invested and working on developing critical caste studies theory, and he draws a lot on intersectionality, race, ethnicity, and caste. So his new book is upcoming, which is called Caste: A Global Story, and today's lecture is all about that. And uh, we are doing this, we are celebrating Ambedkar, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, as not as in person, but as an idea, as a thought in the pressing times that we are facing today, especially when democratic values and human values are being targeted and destroyed on everyday basis, and freedom is in danger. So over to you, Suraj, and very non-American way of doing this, but I welcome you
Thank you.
from UT, Austin, and Woodbury Free.
Thank you. No, if I, you can. You can put these. You can put the screen. Amu. Thank you, everybody. Vishal thinks he's my friend. I know for sure he's my friend. I'm very honored. Let me get some logistical clarities out of the way. So the talk that I have today is entitled "Caste in America." Before I begin, I want to greet you all a very heartwarming Jai Bhim. And you can correspond to my enthusiasm as I recite the name of my ancestors at this August audience, Ambedkar Memorial Lecture. It's an honor to be here, and good job to everybody who have put this together. When Vishal invited me, I replied, I cannot come. Then he followed up one more time, and I still say I cannot come. And then he pursued me third way in a way that I thought I should go. And I was very happy that he made sure that, because I was saying that my book is going to come out next month, I'll rather come later. I have travels planned, and it's very good to see you. So Baba Saheb Ambedkar ki, Bhagwan Buddha ki, Mogali Putta Tissa ki, Samrat Ashok ki, Sant Guru Ravidas की, संत कबीर की, झलकारी बाई की, महात्मा फुले की, सावित्री बाई फुले की, और अभी all the contemporary icons, उन सब की जय, and also jai to you. First of all, thank you to the Austin Buddhist community who have put together this event alongside Indigo, Ammu, and Ruma for very kindly being available and putting this together. Also the UT Student Coalition Against Caste, which is an excellent effort. And I would like to give a shout out to the name that I have, Minakshi. You all stand up. Why don't, if you can, Minakshi, just stand up. Apurva, Adi, if Adi is here, Ishu, Sonu, Nirvika, and of course Vishal. Excellent job. And also let's give a shout out to the Indigo team as well, who has collaborated in such a short period of time. I also want to thank Scott, dear friend, who's really helping us to also expand the horizon of Ambedkar's aura and his Ambedkar's expanding mind. The more we dig into this archaeology of his, we come to realize more things, and it's very fruitful contribution, the rhetoric, the idea of persuasion. I was reading yesterday just his work about the what path to conversion, Mukti Kon Pathe, and the way he brings that analysis of that philosophical communicative studies approach is very rich, enriching. Some of that approach we don't take because we are just looking at religious aspect of it, we are looking at social aspect of it, we don't really look at what it means in generic terms and how it is communicated. I also have my friends Amit, Ashish is there, Anup is there, Monali is there. Thank you. And my dear friend from Harvard is here, Anmol Mehra. Anmol must be somewhere here. Anmol is right there. And let's give it up for Anmol. Anmol is an organizer here and also a good friend. We crossed paths at Harvard, and then I stayed with him for the past 2 nights trying to also get on terms with, very much involved in the academic scene, in art scene as well. So let's go with the slides. Do I have to do something, or you have to? You can do it.
I can do it.
Yeah, why don't you do it then? Or there's nothing I can do from here, right? So this is something that's not exactly part of my next book. There's a section that's I'm going to present, but I just thought I'll put it at the first because the presentation I gave a month ago at Harvard, this was the last slide and I forgot to show. So I thought the better to compensate by showing it the front. We can go to the next number. Thank you. So when we look at these archives of caste in America, some of these photographs you can take, some of them I will request you to not take because they are still in the process of, they're still, I still need to do something with them. But these are all available, so you can take as much. Um, the question of caste example, it's a 19th century question. We think about it, how it was debated, and Senator Charles Sumner down in Massachusetts was wrestling with this question. And where did he, one of the profound things Charles Sumner did, he was abolitionist, a radical person of the time, and also fought for desegregation during that time in Massachusetts Supreme Court. And the idea of caste having a resonance in America was very much rooted with how caste was observed in India. It was a very communicative discourse. And one of the educations the people here were having was, we can go next, was somebody, a French, Abbé du Bois, who was a missionary. He was, traveling 18th century, wrote about caste, and obviously communicated to the audience in the West. And his observations were something that were picked up. And we ought to know that the European two prominent languages, apart from English, was German and French. And these were also expanding a lexicon, and America also, part of that was French. But the eastern part, the northeast part today, was constituted of looking at how do we understand Indian society. And so we can see the European modern thinking really derives from what is happening in India, especially the new customs and the new discoveries that were, so to speak, coming. Portuguese in the Iberian Empire time in the 16th century looked at that, but eventually then obviously the message goes spread. Michael Harney, who is here, wrote an excellent book on race, caste, and indigeneity. I would recommend you to check it out because he really looked at the travel literature. I mean, people who were traveling during those times. The popular form of exploring the world was travel, and so sometimes you go with like 20 people because you are one of the aristocratic elites, or sometimes you're just there as a Thomas Cook, for example, just trying to gather information. And there's so much written about it, so much misinformation. But yet what we get is caste is informed, but also caste is being narrated as a system, as a society that is hierarchical based, that's religious based, and different kinds of interpretations are provided. So Abbé du Bois kind of is one of the kind of anchors, so to speak, among many others, to kind of bring that attention. And those were the people, especially the new colony of America, was reading. Now, when we think about America, we think about America not as starting from XYZ year. They're still trying to learn from other countries to make sense of their own existence in this. So this is a new colony, and when you're in a new colony, you are exploring what your ancestors did, and one of the studied and researched, and this is where we come to understanding. Now let's go sweeping somewhere else. Bring back to where Dr. Ambedkar here was considered for. I know when he became a big shot, and we'll go back to how this kind of came about. And this is where the Vice President of Columbia, Grayson Kirk, writing to him that we are offering you this and this kind of and Dr. Ambedkar is kind of engaging with this question of thank you for honoring me, LLD. The committee selects. We can go next. And this piece that is coming to fruition is basically across the archival heritage of India, of American newspapers as well as public sphere. Ambedkar is a noticeable name. They're writing about him. They're profiling him. Can we go next? They are finding out references to what kind of efforts he's leading. So Ambedkar is not someone who is unknown to American public. They very much know about it. They are reading about it, and they are very much focused on anti-colonial struggle. So one of the misunderstandings that happen is that oftentimes it is considered that Gandhi was kind of a central actor, which he was. But also alongside Gandhi, there was Ambedkar as well. People were taking stock of Ambedkar's activities. And I think that narrative somehow gets eventually distorted because Howard Thurman kind of picks up that narrative, especially from the African-American sphere, that kind of transfers to MLK, and that kind of narrative kind of continues. But that is not the complete picture. The complete picture is also recorded in the archives. And you can see, the whole, full page kind of, news coverage of Ambedkar is being reported. And this is I think is 1936 news piece that talks about what Ambedkar is doing, what are his objectives, and most of the conversations are two. One is about his conversion, like what religion is he going to go to? Is it Christianity? Is it Islam? And sometimes one of the reporters who goes and interviews him, Ambedkar, he writes that he was just upset with him because the reporter was not aware of what's happening in India, and Ambedkar didn't want to spend time with him explaining things. Something that we kind of relate to now in social justice politics, where you don't want to explain. And so he says, and to his credit, the writer, the journalist, also says yes, it was his mistake, that he should have known better. And so Ambedkar was really impatient about the work that he was doing. Next. And so let's come back to what happens in the 1950s. So now, when he is considered for a honor by Columbia University, it is not all out of sudden. This is something that's been happening for several decades. So when Columbia University reaches out to him, we want to, Ambedkar is saying, listen, this is great, I'm out of job, and I can't come. And so these are the communications where he's trying to raise money. And so they say, we don't really have, because during those days he had to fly by air and there's a lot of expense. And Ambedkar says, what, let's do this. I'll deliver some lectures and maybe you can, compensate. And they say, this is great, but as happens even now, we need at least 6 months notice. And they say, this is not possible. And so there are this kind of communications where, this is one of the proposals for him being appointed as a recommended for the honoris causa degrees. Next, and these are just kind of communications back and forth where they are trying to find a way for Ambedkar to come. And now these archives are very important when you think about caste question in America. It's not just about thinking through through how Hindu society was observed or Hindu society was not observed. There were many layers to this story, and then what we see is over the period of time, the caste question continues to exist in the minds, in the psyche of American public sphere, very much so. Sometimes as an admiration, sometimes as a curiosity, sometimes as something that to be repelled, sometimes as an honoring, sometimes it is looked at as an actively protesting culture. So caste is really present. It is not always looked at through the example of India or Indian caste system, but also it's looked at how American society is a caste-based society. Charles Sumner, for example, looking at the angles of how caste continues to maneuver their everyday relations in America, and that was when the idea of race was being questioned, and they use this. It's a color caste system that kind of segregates, and that's something that we are to embrace. And so, what happens to this old question of caste becoming not just an applicable term to a certain group of people, to a universal terminology that covers many segregations, many ideas of separations, as well as a systemic structural hierarchy that can give us a potent understanding of our own culture. And I think that was the crux of observing where do we point our finger to, and how do we diagnose the problem. And one of this, for example, the Dalit diaspora starts to form as an active Dalit diaspora, and they start to take shape under the influence of Ambedkar's activism. 1952 we see, 1960 onwards Dalits start to come, and these are majority of them are highly educated Dalits. They have gone to the medical top schools or the top engineering schools. They are here to pursue their doctorate at Johns Hopkins or the well-known institution. They're working at top scientific labs. These are the creme de la creme. And this is also a post-Civil Rights Act migration that we see. Many Dalits kind of find their way. And when they come, they are grateful and they are cognizant because they were beneficiaries of Dr. Ambedkar's efforts. So when they come here, by virtue of having reservation or by witnessing the movement, they think of their people back home. And so they're always sort of acting as a communicative tool for people who are undergoing oppression. And we are talking about the era where there were many atrocities. They were not noticed, and they were not reported. So these people were basically reporting what was reported in the newspaper. So they didn't, as opposed to today, where you don't have to find the news in newspaper. Somebody from some village calls their friend, who then communicates to us in the diaspora, and then we are like, we'll take the stock of situation. But yet, the idea to fight for justice remains continuous. And so one of the interesting episode happens here, where Indira Gandhi, for example, is coming, and Indira Gandhi looks at there was atrocity, and a group that is formed is called Vision, Volunteers in the Service of India's Minorities and Oppressed. And this Vision group is formed by early engineers and doctors, and they get together, bunch of families, and during those times they just know communicating each other via mails. And once they find together, they kind of organize Ambedkar's birthday celebration as an occasion for them to kind of unite together and think about possibilities of forming some as a solid group. So Vision is something that is formed, and when Vision is formed, the people there say we have to do more activism. Though we have jobs and we are by now American citizens, but we have to also pursue an agenda to hold Indian government to account. And in this process, what they do is they start hitting out at the power center of India, the Prime Minister's office. So each Prime Minister, whoever comes, is faced with an extreme backlash by this few Dalit activists. So much so that they make news, in Washington Post. Can we go next? And other outlets. Now, this is the letter that Indira Gandhi writes to one very legendary figure who is still alive, Dr. Berwa. And I think we should read. I mean, I have his response, but we'll keep it that for later. And this is something that the Prime Minister of India takes cognizance of, where she acknowledges the efforts by this bunch of people who are Dalits, who are Ambedkarites in their politics, and they are very much rooted in this kind of new revival of political. We can go next. And so what happens is the idea of Dalit Black solidarity kind of continues in this form. They are organizing celebrations of connecting with other solidarity groups, and probably this is the first kind of precursor to some of the work that I started to do. It was kind of laid in after Dr. Ambedkar and Du Bois's distant connection. This was something that they brought together at Harvard University, the historically black college and university. And so this kind of event really has itself a story. I'm giving you just a very nuggets of it. You'll get a detail of it by my book, and you will find about it. That's a plug. But what we essentially see is the activism that we see that starts with locating caste as an Indian problem to becoming an American problem to then experiencing as an outer subject, and now the subjects themselves are oppressed by caste, taking the responsibility upon themselves to showcase their atrocities and their victimhood. Next. These are some of the pictures and that gentleman is Dr. Berwa, who basically, in response to Indira Gandhi's letter, writes, "You are such a mean person." He writes a very strong worded letter to Indira Gandhi, and he doesn't, and so what we see is this kind of flamboyant activism continues to loosen its grip in contemporary times as the Dalit middle class, who starts to occupy the third generation of jobs, becoming more insecure. So today we will not imagine at all anybody in the Dalit diaspora, especially the middle class migrants who have come here, to think about anything to even write to Prime Minister's office or anticipate a strong worded letter. There will always be, there's a protest, there is an angst to do a kind of collective riposte against any form of oppression, but we don't see a concrete concerted effort to cross over the lines, and that has to do with the class dimension and also experiences of caste atrocity. Now, these were one of the earlier generation people who had faced it all. Many, oftentimes, the second, third generation are English educated. They have had access to relatively comfortable lifestyle because they've had parents, one of the parents having education and having a job. So when this group of people looks at Dalit struggle as a cultural form of expressing their belonging, it is not political and it is not sociologically tenable for them to really take upon responsibilities to counter anything to it. So it's almost a state assimilationist kind of politics. Next. Some of this kind of solidarity then kind of fits into the narrative of how caste archives were kind of penetrated into this UT caste coalition, also part of this kind of caste America's story that we continue to see. Next. The gentleman on the left is Yogesh Varade, who started Ambedkar Center for Justice and Peace. He was a Canadian, grew up in Nagpur, experienced the conversion Dr. Ambedkar did in 1956 as a boy, went to Germany to study engineering, and then moved to Canada. I think moved to America and then moved to Canada. And he started the most persistent anti-caste lobby at the UN and other government level organizations. He organized many educated Dalits in the 90s and early 2000s who were then part of this struggle. And these are the people who are going full on, who are not really taking it secondhand. Next. Now, we won't see such kind of flyer in present times held by anybody. We may see the Sikh groups may do because they have a stake in that, but we won't see this in the contemporary form of Dalit activism. So something we see is this will be even considered almost blasphemous. We don't want to do that. I don't want to identify with such kind of flyers. So that's kind of, we see a transition into how Dalit epistemology, the knowledge of belonging, becomes so rooted in capitalist neoliberal desires that protest culture is very much rooted in cultural celebration of few occasions. Next. This is where again the continuous, when as I said, any prime minister who kept coming to US, they were faced by this kind of radical. Now we don't see this as much. Why? Because they have not. Some of them have died, or so some of them are just immobile. And there was this direct question about Indian government's legitimacy, but also the political forces that were acting in this country. Vishwa Hindu Parishad or Bajrang Dal and so forth, who are doing there, but also they have their offshoots here. So the struggle was two-way. One was to also fight within the American soil, but also to look at what's happening elsewhere in India and other parts of the world. Next. This is something, when Bajpayee was doing, that's my father, and this is happening in Nanded. And I think that kind of legacy, I hope to continue, in the sense of my father's protesting where Indian government refused, Bajpayee government refused to acknowledge caste as an important form of discrimination when 2001 Durban conference had taken place, where race, the conference again, race was discussed at that conference. And I did not know, I just stumbled into old archives of family photographs. This was protested in 2001, and then one can see, I was looking at what this really means to a family story, personal story, and growing up into this kind of activism that now I occupy. I mean, he was sitting in Nanded, a small town, thinking about United Nations and the future of this community, while now I, on the other hand, have access to all of those avenues and occupy those spaces to kind of maintaining the story. A little about what it meant for people like Yogesh Varade and Lakshmi Berwa to operate in America or Canada as a diasporic society. One of their approaches was to rescue people who were victims of caste atrocities by the Brahminical Hindu caste system, to really provide them a restitutive effort. And for that, they always focused on government agencies. So it has to be, and that's a very Ambedkarite approach, because what they did was essentially they went to, let's say, United States Foreign Senate Committee, and they lobbied with them. They say, what, we would like you to, whenever you will make a report, or whenever the new head of state or Indian prime minister is going to come, or defense minister is going to come, we want you to raise these few issues. And then there are so many letters that I have in the boxes where the senators are replying to Dr. Berwa to say, yeah, I have your letter, and when I will sit for at a dinner table with the XYZ prime minister, I will make sure I raise this point. So there is a very formalized way of activism that they are creating, and also they are creating the archives. They are creating the records for how activism ought to be imagined. And then we see a phase with another of stalwarts of many of them. No, Raju Kamble. I had these photos. I had to use it. But I also stumbled upon in Houston a huge kind of boxes that are preserved there in Houston, where he sadly passed away a few years ago, and that was his last Ambedkar Jayanti function. And Raju Kamble was someone who was an engineer, a cadre of BAMSEF organization. After BAMSEF, he got inducted into the politics of thinking about worked with Kanshiram, Mayawati, and the lot. He was somebody who went to Indian Institute of Science in the 1960s, I believe, and got job with the government sector, and the left went to Middle East. Wherever he went, he carried the Ambedkarite ethos in his politics. So he was one of the earliest persons to form an Ambedkarite international, what he called missions. Such an interesting word. Missions usually we use at when government have their offices as to mission of this, mission of that. He almost became a diplomat of Ambedkarite cause. So wherever he went, he started Ambedkar International Missions. One of them is also here in Houston recently. And so these kind of missions are formed, and they act as an outpost of a Dalit expression, a Dalit existence, and a Dalit revolt against the hegemonic practices of caste system. So Raju Kamble's story again, his very crux of forming a organization was to again consider what can Ambedkarite values do to change the condition of his people back home. And therefore, education became one of the powerful tools. Contemporary Dalit activism is also invested in education, but in a very charitable context. So the vision is almost obfuscating from what they did. I mean, so he would go anywhere and distribute books of Dr. Ambedkar when people were not aware of it. And these were the books that he would come bring here. So whenever he went to India, his other bag most likely would be full of Ambedkar's books, or books related to the Dalit history, mostly in English, and he would distribute them alongside. And that's how kind of slow form of activism was kind of given shape in his milieu. Next. And so what we see is in contemporary times, that kind of form of activism continues. In this form, for the George Floyd happened, and you see there is a flyer hold up, and that's me who's holding my hand is there. Which was so. What we see, what I see, and most of us recognize is that there is a long thread of history that has been continuing this form of activism, and we have to get out. We have to do this kind of stuff, without which they won't be an appropriate decorum that will require for a sophisticated movement to take place. I mean, it has to be messier, it has to be complex, it has to be extremely dangerous in this form to operate, especially in contemporary times. Next. And of this also, one important group of Dalits in America are the people who are an offshoot of Sikh religion. They also identify as Sikh, but sometimes they call themselves Ravidasya. Ravidasya is named after the untouchable saint who was incorporated in the religious text of Sikh, the Adi Granth, where they were mistreated by the higher caste people. So they just decided to bid adieu to that kind of practice of Gurudwara, the Sikh temple, and form their own institutions across the United States. And that thing, Sri Guru Ravidas Mark, is one of their way to demonstrate that they have also established their legitimate presence by espousing the values of their Guru. And this is, I think, in New York, where such kind of coordinated effort, one of the most radically involved, engaged audience of Dalit activism is led by the Punjabi diaspora, who are Ravidasyas and also espouse Ambedkar's beliefs. And this is something also part of Archive is having Dalit Film and Cultural Festival, which I co-organized a few years ago before COVID. And this is something that kind of informs us about the expanding values of the archives. Now, there's something I would like to read out as part of my own kind of thinking. What I think in broader terms is the sporadic activism against caste in the West, which is here in the US, and counter lobbying by Brahminical right-wing elements that comprise Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, Jain, and Christian conservative lobbies. They invite us to think critically about minority groups in the United States as well as the West more generally. What does this new social class of minorities tell us, considering that Indians are usually regarded as one and the same thing? The assertion of Dalits in challenging the caste system at the university level and carrying a united fight to the UN and other places of power had disturbed people's understanding of what constitutes an Indian identity. It has also presented us with an emerging archive. One such archive, as I show, was preserved by Lakshmi Verva, who he donated to me. And something I started to do in British Columbia, Canada, to start collecting what we call Caste in Canada project to record the history of Dalits in Canada. One of the founding members of Indian diaspora in Canada, among the earliest arrivals, were Dalits as well. But that story is really masked because it takes a position of regional, religion, and national identity. But then when we when we dug it deeper, we found that there were at least two Dalits who had alighted off that ship that were considered the pioneers of, so to speak. But also, in addition to this archive of Dalit diaspora history, there are also other official reports. Now, recently, Rutgers came out with an Rutgers University Task Force on Caste Discrimination, which was basically providing guidelines and recommendations on how caste has to be analyzed, how caste has to be observed. Similarly, in Australia, the Human Rights Commission, their National Human Rights Commission, undertook macro survey of the caste situation in Australia, and they've kind of provided also Asang Wankide. They did that kind of report. Now, this raises the question, especially about the United States. With all this happening, with SB 403 where, in California, where it almost passed. I mean, it passed the Senate. It just was vetoed by the governor Newsom. Does the United States foster community revolutions? That's the question. In the larger diasporic struggle for justice, the United States represents the leading center of empire. US hegemony is likely to continue as the second and third generation of Dalits assimilate into the American order, thereby confirming its legitimacy. However, I've recently noticed a sense of reservation and distance from leading Dalit activists and political leaders toward America or the Indian diaspora. About a decade ago, there was a surge of activists and scholars heading to the West. But lately, it seems to me there has been decline in enthusiasm for America among Indian-based political and social actors. This may partly be due to the absence of any credible social movements that openly align with Dalit political parties back home. Also, the Dalit diaspora has not openly declared its association and solidarity with similar groups back home. A political party leader from Maharashtra, and you will know who it is, once told me on the phone in a scolding tone that diaspora Dalits think they are the smartest and they know what is best for the community. He said that I live in India and I'm aware of political situation more keenly than you all who live abroad or are trying to effect change here in this country. Earlier, the same leader had told me about the sorry state of the UK Ambedkarites, which he had experienced a couple of decades prior when he went to Britain with the President of India on an official visit. There is an apathy in India towards the diaspora, as their needs and demands are not always agreeable to leaders back home. Though this is not always the case, I have seen a similar instance involving another political leader from India. The professional class Dalits are mostly hesitant to declare an anti-state position in America. There is also a lack of political education among the diasporic population who, barring rare exceptions, have not involved themselves in political organizing. Leaders of major Dalit diaspora groups are rooted in middle-class Indian activism back home. Their work revolves around cultural activities, organizing festivals and get-togethers. At times of atrocities and social upheaval, they try to fundraise. Their working style is one that favors passive change and slow intervention. Occasionally, some Dalit diaspora groups align with Indian political parties. Yet there is no consensus among its members. The Dalit diaspora Ambedkarite organizations have distanced themselves from political leaders in India and have not made significant contributions to the movements back home. An exception to this is the Malaysian Ambedkarites, who started off as political projects. Malaysian Ambedkarites is an amazing example, who were a political party. The Dalits in Malaysia started off, and they were Ambedkarites, and more on that is in the book. In other diasporic Dalit organizations, politics and social activism are not on the agenda. Rehabilitations of victims of atrocities and education are priorities of the organizations that bear Ambedkar's name in America, Canada, and Australia. Since the Middle Eastern Ambedkarites could not contribute to political lobbying or social organizing because of the Middle Eastern surveillance, they focus on small scale funding activities like starting coaching centers or giving education to people. In the United States, there is now rarely research-based advocacy or lobbying with senatorial representatives, as was seen in the earlier phase of Dalit organizing in America. I was myself an active member of many Ambedkar groups from 2015 and 20. All of my friends are sitting here who I work with. During this period, I observed that the issue of social justice remained a priority. However, this had not to do with the United States, but with the activities of social justice organizations in India. And that's why what we see many oftentimes when George Floyd happened, the Dalit diaspora did not really feel the need to come out. When the entire political spectrum was coming out, it was I who had to kind of reach out to them and inform that we have to. And it has to do with how political education and assimilation into the American dream of upwardly mobile class politics informs not just Indian as a group, but also Dalits in this, who try to imitate and mimic the kind of essence of belonging to America. But this kind of is starting to change when Pulitzer Center awarded a grant to investigate caste in America. That was a project done a few years ago, and that project, Philip Martin, the senior investigative reporter, he kind of traveled with me to my hometown, and then he reported about caste in America also in here. That really provided a new churning, a new understanding of this politics. Now, what we see is the archive of caste is also very much in process of revealing and learning about itself. Now, oftentimes, the agenda within the Ambedkarite politics, because of absence of clear goals, started to pick up whatever was offered to them, and that really derailed their movement. One of that agenda was where people started to weaponize agendas of gender, in this case, to really silence radical politics that was being formed. And that's what created a much more victimization in the organizing of Dalit movement in here. And the way it did was to really have a performative politics as opposed to really devoted politics of reformation. It was really meant to have a tokenistic representation of a certain person or a certain group of people, which really fill into the identity politics that now is really seeing its day. Trump is in the power, Trump is in the House, and much of the woke politics is now pushed back upon. And that has not to do with collective organizing, that has to do with how tokenistic representations were formed. Dalit diaspora activism was also part of this kind of limitations of not having to look at the broader picture. Now, with that, there are certain positive efforts. With one was SB 403, the Cisco kind of caste discrimination case that saw, as we see. But also, I heard Texas is also now is on the state is now considering taking this battle. So these are kind of coordinated efforts. One of the positive contributions is that the Ambedkar diaspora has now made effectively a positive change. For example, supporting activities at the universities level, the kind of active decision to really put yourself out in this pedagogical sense of realizing new forms of knowledge and new forms of politics. And so what we see is, as caste was being shaped by Dalits in India, it also underwent an overhaul in the diasporic spaces. We can go to Caribbean, the Dalit laborers there. One can also argue that similar pattern was formed in American other societies. Caste was not an imported dogma, but a new quality of life that was refashioned by those who couldn't resist its incursion into the daily life of spiritual practice. Thus, the story of caste cannot be understood by focusing solely on the South Asian landscape. One has to extend the study to other places where caste was interpreted, embraced, as well as rejected. Caste reveals how localized institutions provide a base for the imaginative impulse of caste to survive amidst amorphous forms. There is no one form of caste to make sense. You have to really look at it the way you bring a religion question and then it takes its own form. You bring a gender position, it takes its own form. You bring sexuality, it really takes its own form. You bring religion and region, it takes its own form. Caste, therefore, I argue, is a journey, an itinerary of global identities and demographics. Caste very much is a global story. And for us to foreground that theoretical analysis, we have to look at social movements as one of the effective models to assess our own pedagogies that will give us a certain direction in understanding the limitations to critically analyze the politics of culture and present. Thank you. Thank you. You want to get it?
We can take some questions, and I think we should sit. It's okay? Yeah. So, does anyone have a question in the audience? Okay, Naksh.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, thank you. This is amazing. And like specifically the archive work, which is like there's also like the absence of archives, right? When you have to like really look through. So I'm really grateful to just be sitting here listening to you. I mean, couple of questions, but like one primary question, because we're sitting here in the US, you're talking about like Black and Dalit solidarity. I'm always curious about like Ambedkar being in Colombia right after Harlem Renaissance, and like what was his like,
Yeah.
I'm like, he's a cool guy, he's also woke. So
That's
like
right.
he's obviously there, like he is very much aware of like what's happening in the US. And like has it been documented? Like I know there's a letter with like exchange with Du Bois, but I'm like always very curious about like what was he thinking, and like do you have any like insights into that,
That's
like
right.
whether did it come up in your research?
Thank you, Meenakshi.
Yeah.
I think that's a. So what I did was I wrote a paper called Dalit in Black America.
Yeah.
And in that kind of you get nuggets of how Ambedkar was reported and also appreciated in the African American public
Mm.
sphere. So the black population was also very much aware of that. So what we usually have is a narrative of um, how he is looked at, how he is analyzed, but also he's somebody who is mainstream. I mean, that was something revealing to me personally, and I was thinking, why would they care about him?
Mm.
And then you realize that the history of how America was assessing itself has, in some way, also by looking at India. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Historically, also they were looking at that part to make sense of themselves. That's why caste as an idiom is very much prevalent, not to just define Shudras
Yeah.
and Brahmins, but they were looking at this as a condition that affects white and as well as black. And so, very much so, the secular nature of caste was seen. And so Ambedkar's efforts of interdining, for example, was hit.
Mm.
Like the columnist George Schuyler, a conservative columnist, was like, we have to do this. Like, listen, like this is Jim Crow. He's like, look, he's sitting next to, interdining was very much prohibited in Jim Crow, in case anybody, segregation and all of that. And that was the same condition with the Dalits in India. So Ambedkar's one of the efforts was, whenever he would launch a movement or he would just give a speech, his dominant caste colleagues, he would ask them to host everybody who host them for dinner. So that would really give a message that we are all working together, because you can come in public and have solidarity, but you don't want that person to be in your house. So that was his kind of clever efforts. And one of the persons who hosted was Bal Gangadhar Tilak's son, in Gaikwad in Pune, in a conservative region. So he was a cadre of Ambedkar. And very ironically enough, after his passing, he went to Ambedkar, joined social conference, and then he went there. And there was all hell broke loose, because the Brahmins were irritated. Like, how come he had all the Dalits come here and eat? Those kinds of efforts were so multi-pronged that the black people, at least some section, felt like this was unnecessary. Religion was something that really kept their interest alive, like, because his move, he was critiquing Hinduism, and because the condition of untouchables, 35,000, this the archive is so much that I could just spend on one box, because it's just fascinating. Yeah. It's just tells you a story one after another. The reason this thing is also not aligned and it's messed up with years was because, to understand that it's not following the story.
Yeah.
It is going back forth. It is a narrative that is constructed. Okay, this is how caste is. But then you look at certain archive and say, okay, what, caste is really doesn't mean what they are really saying in previous years or later years. So the evolving nature of caste is really a central expense of what caste politics does to us. So he's in Harlem. So one of the biographers of Ambedkar is like, when he went there as a student in Columbia, 6 months he was just being a brat. He was just a young boy, just going around, messing around and having fun. So, and then the biographer says, oh, one day he realized, damn, what am I doing? So he's young. I don't know how old is he, 19 or something like that. When he comes to 1891, 1913, 23, and this is his first exposure. But then Eleanor Zillett talks about he was having exposure to this black culture, and one of the things he writes to Du Bois is very important. He said, I have read your work throughout. That's a very strong claim. Now, he might be hyperbolic about it. He might not have read all of Du Bois's, but important works he might have definitely. Now, if Scott was here, he would have probably told us if he found anything to do with, because he goes and looks at Ambedkar's books, what kind of books he was reading. And we don't know that, but clearly he is writing about slavery and the black condition in America. He even makes a comparison of slavery and untouchability, and he's trying to he's meeting people like the leading black intellectuals of the time who are going to India are meeting him. Not all of them, and one of the things when MLK is taken to India, for example, there is no mention of Ambedkar in MLK. He visits untouchable quarters, untouchable schools in Kerala, but he's not aware of Ambedkar, because one reason is that Congress, who was by then investing very much to eliminate Ambedkar's legacy or his memory, was probably doing that. They just did not wanted Ambedkar, one of the most uncomfortable tracts for them to really confront. So what we see is this kind of archives are so interpretive, they are so animating, they are so engaging, and then the politics of national resistance comes to fore. Like, so when Ambedkar is saying, and this is important, right? Ambedkar is saying it's fine, you're fighting against British colonies, but we want to be liberated because this is more pernicious, the caste system. And newspapers find that interesting. And this is the time, by the way, where anti-colonial resistance is appreciated across the world. It's like Palestinian struggle happening right now, and some people are saying, Palestinian struggle, we need liberation, but also we want to talk about internal hierarchies. People are like, wait a minute, we want one agenda to be fixed first. But Ambedkar is someone who's saying, no, it has to go alongside. In fact, he makes it a primary objective of that. And the intellectual sphere is like, okay, that's a clever move. So I think that kind of politics continues to operate. And Ambedkar, even after not being here, he sends many students here on the government scholarship. One of them was M.N. Wankhede, who was a principal of Milind College that he formed in Aurangabad. And there is a big section on M.N. Wankhede, if not in my book, in my thesis at Oxford, is where he basically starts the Dalit black literature kind of comparisons. He is somebody who studies Walter Whitman, but then when he goes back to India, he becomes like, he mentors students, and one of the students he mentors is Janardhan Wagmare, who writes Dalit Negro Sahitya, the genre that was created around this time. So this is what led to eventual formation of Dalit Panthers, which was basically M.N. Wankhede becomes like a default distant theoretician. So there is this kind of legacy, a very interesting story that continues. So something what I do is not extraordinary or nothing new. There is a long thread of kind of movement that has been operating, and that kind of happens through university spaces, and many people, Vishal and other people, now continue to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Suraj. So you mentioned like you face criticism when you are talking, like from folks in India, you face criticism on talking about Dalit issues in India, being a global scholar and having come here. So I mean, I'm curious, like what was Baba Saheb Ambedkar's experience with returning to India, as well as his students, and this sort of disconnect that diasporic advocates face.
You mean the criticism in India?
Yeah, so coming maybe like in the experience of returning to speak on issues that are of course global but also local in India.
I think it's a valid question. The critique is not very much mature. It's straw man. It's very reductive. It's very nationalistic, and it's very unreal. It's when you hear the critique, you don't even muster the energy to even reply, because it's just like that person is also like for example, like just to comedically speaking about, it's like people don't have problem eating cows manure, but they have problem with eating cow, meaning eating cow shit is okay in India now than eating cow. That kind of discourse is so present, in the sense that when people who are doing this job of cow and buffaloes as slaughtering and eating as a consumption for many years, that is a critique held against, which is very much a honestly Jain critique, not even Hindu critique, but it becomes Hinduized in its violent form. But then they're happy eating cow shit as some Vedic ritual, or some if you look at that level of polemics that they deploy, you really don't want to engage with these people, right? I mean, people, and the unfortunate thing is that many of them have derived a form of legitimacy in this illogical actions just because it happens to be an ancestral heritage or memory of the past, which really doesn't make sense. In the sense, the memory and history is constructed, it's mythical and it's formative. And one of my personally objective is to challenge that, and that is by Buddhism. The Buddhist heritage is real. The Brahminical heritage is not real because it is constructed upon the Buddhist iconographies and mythographies. Historically, there didn't existed the Hindu faith as such, for example. So it's a political colonial kind of idea that becomes. Brahminical faith, which was again conglomeration of various subcastes, independent religions, becomes one. But then if you look at the sites that are stolen by Hindus currently, are majority belong to Buddhists. Like any historical site you see that has a history of more than 1500 years, it is Buddhist by default. And you will notice that because many of the Buddhist, for example, Mahayana art that kind of came up with this new formations, the serpent kind of what we were talking about Nagas yesterday, or we are talking about different kind of, like the goddesses that are created, for example. The goddesses is basically a creation out of Buddhist lore. Ramayana, for example, also is not an original text. It comes from the Jatak Kathas from the Buddhist canon. So what we see is much of historiography, India, especially a united Indian discourse operated since Ashoka's time. That's why we celebrated Ashoka before I started. I was asking you also to celebrate him, because what he did was he united that corpus of South Asia by giving it a form of Dhamma, a political identity, but also spiritual discourse. And then that continued. So eventually what happened in the counter-revolutionary form, these were basically appropriated. So majority temples, as I said, and so now the irony is within the Hindu Muslimization discourse, this history is left aside. And we ought to be careful not to fall into the trap of Hindu Muslimization, because even the Muslim history has to do with the Buddhist past. So does the Hindu history has to do with Buddhist past. We have to go to the kind of a kernel of material heritage history, and that's what is an appropriate term. And Ambedkar was, that's why when I keep thinking about why would he choose or relinquish his citizenship of Hinduism and go elsewhere, because there is much more legitimacy that one can draw from, as opposed to other kind of identities of religion that are very much colonially constructed. Ambedkar was, as you can realize, he was very much pre-colonial in his mind, if you will, or he didn't consider colonialism as the only point of interaction, as the only point of historical materialism that he can relate to. He's like, this is one episode of many other episodes, because we have seen history, it is written about, it is celebrated. And so for us, for him it is about looking at East Asia. Ambedkar is the only guy who is blending East and Western solidarity, and very few of us talk about that. Of course, we talk about non-aligned movement as something that was formed in the 1960s and anti-colonial. Ambedkar looked at West when Nehru was like, what, we got to make alliance with Russia, and Ambedkar writes to him, is like, it's tomfoolery. Let's not get into it. Let's get American technology on board. We need their money as well, and they are distributing it. So Ambedkar's much of the modernist projects are American driven. Like American engineers are there, the huge dams, the electricity kind of projects are supported by Americans. But also he's like, let's go also not get engulfed into the Western idea. Let's also look at the East. And then he looks through East through the Buddhist paradigm. He's like, we also need Buddhist country solidarities and Japanese. So he sent one of his associates, P.N. Rajboj, actually visits, does a Buddhist tour. And so what he's doing is Ambedkar's kind of, politics is also very much internationally focused. He's very diplomatic. And we don't talk about it. I mean, I had written a paper, article, Ambedkar's internationalism, because we don't talk about it. We look at Ambedkar only through a very confined mirror view that really substantiate our comfort zones. But he's also, he's also full of faults, because he's not looking at politics in, because for him it was a revolution to be done in certain way, which in a way now one thinks about is true, because he refused communism, for example, right? So why do we, when we look at this long history of, it is actually a compliment to follow in that legacy and receive the same kind of treatment that Ambedkar received. Ambedkar, for example, a friend of mine, Mangesh Dehbale, told me, Ambedkar once he said, I'm the most hated man in India. And that's a very depressive statement. Like, somebody, a national leader of that a stature when he is announcing that he's the most hated man in India. That means how much mental pressures he must be going, how much of the media was against him, how much negative propaganda that was heralded against him. And yet to be a leader of the people who are not educated is a very, because you understand people are emotionally driven and Ambedkar is logically driven, but how could he amass that emotionally driven mass to be with him is really a kind of a case study. And I think somebody who's studying organizing and as part of their research could probably help us understand how did this really come to fruition. Yeah.
So a few years back, am I audible or
Mhm.
you want mic? Okay. So few years back, I ran into someone who was doing some sort of research in Columbia University about Dr. Ambedkar, and what I was told, again, I'm not like researcher, but you spoke about East and West connection of Dr. Ambedkar. So Ambedkar heavily analyzed the federal papers, or the one which has been written by Alexander Hamilton, and he was kind of inspired by also. So if, since you are doing research, do you have any idea about that? And if you want to throw some light on that, that would be great. So,
Actually, this is so important, and I'm sorry I did not do any. I didn't look at his references to American constitutionalism. I think that will be a very good revelation. I've not done that actually.
they had similar background also. That's what I was told, but I never took it upon.
That's a good point. Thank you. I'll take that on board.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, Suraj. Thank you for visiting UT. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about Baba Saheb's and your own thoughts on the role of dominant caste in the caste abolition struggle. And I asked that question as a Savarna woman, like how can I participate in the anti-caste struggle from within the confines of my struggle and lacking the lived experiences that have made this an important issue for me growing up.
Thank you. What's your name?
Rashi.
Rashi, thank you. I mean, in my first book, Caste Matters, second book, I wrote, there's a chapter, the last chapter is called Brahmins Against Brahminism. And many Brahmins didn't like it because they were like, Brahmins cannot be revolutionaries. So I gave this talk in Chennai, and a revolutionary Brahmin person, he disagreed with my proposition. He said, no, you cannot be a Brahmin and be revolutionary. You have to choose between this and that. And he had an argument. He was so much driven. He ended up writing a critique in EPW, Economic and Political Weekly, and it was very thoughtful critique because his position was he's a Brahmin, but he's like the elements of Brahminism that exist in that, to loosely kind of frame his argument. He was like, that doesn't really constitute a struggle against caste. It really provides a certain space for one to vent out and give. And I found that critique interesting. My position was, and I drew from Phule and Ambedkar's legacy, where the people who were devoted to the struggle. So what happens? There are two levels of looking at this. One is a charismatic aura of a person and people driven by their cause, right? So there is this person who is good and you want to go and support. The other is their cause. It's so good, I don't like the person, but I believe in the cause. And on the other scenario, what happens is there is no charismatic aura or person in the cause. And so in absence of that, the question of caste abolition becomes into caste assimilation. I will explain how. In the first scenario, if you have dominant caste friends, and their agenda is nothing to do with caste, and you just happen to be friends with them, you rarely advocate that agenda with them because there is fear. There is this, because caste really creates this mind of inferiority. You're already victimized, and you really have to overcome that victimization to then challenge the other person. Oh, that's a lot of things to ask. And also the sphere is not available because your group of people are only them. So you will see many Dalits in the diaspora also, they are very ashamed to identify themselves as Dalits. They use identity, oh, we are Ambedkarites, we are Buddhists. They use anything but to find their caste location. And this inferiority of the mind is not their fault. It is how the society has made them conditioned. So very rarely, in my book, also the Dalit households, especially middle class, upper middle class, who live in urban areas, they rarely have anything in their house that would suggest that they belong to the Dalit community, despite everybody knowing that they are Dalits. But they would like hide whatever photographs, in any households, any reference to that would identify them, because they are fearful of what my outing will do to that relationship. And that relationship is very much conditioned upon how that other person is commercially invested in maintaining, right? And so occasionally, when there is a position of caste liberalism, or talking about abolition in some sense, then the Dalits are so devoted by that they end up giving more space to the Savarna person. Now, I was in Boston. I'll give an example. There was a woman from dominant caste, and she was from dominant caste, and she had come here. She had no experience of caste at all. But then she found a good group of people, Dalits, and they welcomed her and they gave her a space and all of that. And so next thing, without any realization, she started to almost become default spokesperson of the group of Dalits, right? And whenever she was challenged, she would say that she's a woman, so she needs more position. So this was like an extreme vulgar weaponization of a politics of justice, where then you could not really raise. And the Dalits who started to give her that space felt grateful that somebody at least. So that's the achievement they have. They say at least somebody is doing. They didn't realize the broader politics. So that's one aura. Second aura is Ambedkar and Phule's aura, where they were like, this is our project. We're going to go and burn down the houses of this inequality. And the Savarna people, they were like, we love it. We want to be part of it. And they say, the doors are open. And many times, example, Phule's, for example, schools and stuff like that were actually supported by Brahmins, the Chitpavan Brahmins there, because they believed in that cause. In fact, Phule's best friend was a Brahmin, Govande. Savitri Phule and Govande's wife studied together to become teachers. So that's the kind of relation. But what happens is, the Brahmins are given not the inspiration of people like Govande. They are given inspirations like the god with 10 heads, who is killing a Muslim or killing a Dalit or something like that. So they are withdrawing the humanity from this child, who can have good aspirational figures. Even Baniyas, I keep telling, Baniyas have good figures. Like, go at least draw inspiration from Lohia, a good socialist leader, good Lohia. But they end up having inspiration who are thugs, who are looting the country and not paying taxes. So the Savarnas don't have admirable, hopeful icons to look up to. And that's why they become a very second-rate generation of human beings when it comes to justice. So I advocated, I said, you have to be cultural suicide bomber if you have to become member of this. And these were all cultural suicide bombers, like amazing bunch of people. In fact, this is very wrong image that is presented. Ambedkar burned Manusmriti. He never burned Manusmriti. And the Dalits keep on repeating that he never did anything. I mean, Ambedkar, why would he even get into the idea of, why would he, his Brahmin friend burnt it. He said, okay, burn. He just stood next by it. But the Dalits are again, because of the politics is so hyperbolic and so they think Ambedkar burnt it. But what Ambedkar was is, Ambedkar provided that platform to Savarnas to say, this is fully also provided. But the leadership, it was always clear. Ambedkar was very, even there was a guy called Shinde who started depressed class mission in the 1920s. Ambedkar was very vehement. He said only Dalits can lead the cause of Dalits. No other leader can be. Even this guy was Maratha, and he said no. Even though you may be lower caste, but you are not Dalit, and so you cannot lead Dalit cause. You can do any other cause. And this is him having clarity in the 1920s. And Phule, as you know, like Periyar, Phule, these are more radical than Ambedkar. These people are just basically breaking the gods. Periyar taking the statues of gods and breaking. He said this is all superstition. Phule writing summons to gods. He's like, I'm waiting here. You guys come and do whatever you want me to do. So these are extremely right, and these are lower caste. They are not Dalits. but they realized the importance of anti-caste politics, right? And so there's no accident that Ambedkar kind of continues that legacy. And so Savarnas, in this sense, have to be cultural suicide bombers. They have to utilize their cultural privileges to really blow that off, to create much more fragments of themselves. Assimilation or having a conversation is only one part of that kind of dialogue. You will have a dialogue and then you will move on. You will have, but if you want to really kind of bring about that change, and I think we need to focus on what it meant. When Ambedkar started social conference in Mumbai, it really meant that the Savarnas were willing to cooperate. And he said, okay, you want to do it, do whatever you can. But he also advised them, go and work with your communities. And that's what happened. Tilak's son that I had just mentioned, he committed suicide because he couldn't convince the other Brahmins and other Savarnas to change their mind. He was so frustrated. And this is, by the way, the radical conservative Tilak, right? Who says the Brahmins are from Arctic. And he is one of the theoreticians of modern Brahminism. His son is an Ambedkarite, anti-caste. And Ambedkar provides him a space in his movement. He doesn't say, oh, you are a Tilak Sari, so you must be. He assesses them. But it only comes from when you have that personality who has that aura and is clear about the vision of his movement. That is a little bit absent. And so for that now, university spaces, in especially diaspora and other, are important places. And I think we need to start populating that and be part of this kind of movement.
Follow-up question.
Yes, we can take one last question. Because we're running out of time.
I mean, if anyone else wants to go, they can, or else I have follow-up.
Okay.
There's a hand up.
Susan, good.
I'm very interested in what you're talking about, kind of the what is like the politics, like these neoliberal politics of like sort of cultural performativity.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, like sort of like cultural nationalism. You know, and I've seen in the case of the United States, like a lot of this, you know, a lot of like frameworks, you know, talking about this being the result of like the post-COINTELPRO, like
Yeah.
a lot of these like militant, like sort of self-providing groups. You know, and the shift towards, you know, the nonprofit industrial complex of like, you know, so I'm sort of interested in like, what are there any sort of specific like shifts, organizations that like,
Yeah.
That sort of are like causing a shift. You talk about like this, like sort of assimilation that's kind of like you talk about like politics of belonging, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I guess also it's kind of like I think you talked a lot about the pushback, you know, and but I'd be interested in hearing about that as well.
I think it's interesting. You know, I think neoliberalism is successful because it created its outpost in the form of nonprofits, and it really zoned on some specific issues and made it mainstream. Doesn't mean the causes are any less important. Doesn't mean the nonprofit institution is less important, but the industry that is really working on the doles of the percentage of the capitalist class really created, and this is old debate. This is not new. And when USAID happened, many people were like, so what? Because, you know, anyway, this was, you know, show and tell kind of movement. There was a lot of angst about it. I can tell you about the diasporic Dalit movement, since, you know, we are on the topic. The NGOization of that cause really hampered, where obsessive nature of kind of that did perform, and all of this cultural appropriation of politics around tokenistic kind of anti-cultural Marxist values started to take place, where it really became difficult. Like, how do I contest a stupid point, but then that person is claiming a certain identity that if I say something against will be challenged in a very negative way. So then what do you do? It's a double-edged sword, and really there's no escape. Either you sacrifice yourself or somebody else will sacrifice you. You're going to be the victim nevertheless, despite you being an original victim. You know, that's what happens. And, you know, the movements here also became engrossed in not a regular movements. Movements are people driven. not donor driven. And oftentimes, and I have this experience, some organization wanted to do some cause, some work with us, but they had their own agenda. Like we went through all the conversations, and at the end, they had this specific agenda, and that's not their problem. They just have that agenda. Now, do you want to do that agenda? Do you want to fall into that agenda of what they believe in just to survive, or do you just want to make a call to say, you know what, it doesn't work with us, it's good to know you, maybe in future we will find something. And I think the caste question in America is not thoroughly researched. We don't have proper surveys, like proper academic survey. We don't have. Whatever surveys we have and we cite are poor surveys. They are not even surveys. We cite this report and that report. It's not true. I mean, in the sense of it's, any demographer who is, or any statistician who does this kind of sociological research, if looks at that survey, will be like, will trash that kind of survey. And that's what is hampering the anti-caste objectives in America. Because if you take that to court and other places, this doesn't work, because we are just driven by emotionalism. And most of the time, what has happened is, and this is the phase, the movements across all kind of solidarity movements have to undergo this phase. They have to go. Trump is a phase. They have to undergo that phase, because this is, in a way, doing of these movements. By them not doing what was required at the time, created a polarizing notion of identity and idea that it took an extreme stand. And for us to really recalibrate politics of culture as opposed to politics of work is different. Politics of culture can operate in personal, private spaces, but can that really make a politics of the nation? Nation is a very complex term. People are very complex. People don't vote according to what your friend thinks. They vote according to what they need. Obviously, there will be some inspirations, but at the end of the day, and for us to really understand that national political imagination, we don't have that political thinking. University spaces provide only so much exposure, but that real experience cannot be mimicked. People, if you are not from an oppressed community, if you're not a black person in America, you will not be able to theorize that experience. You can advocate for something, but it cannot be a real movement for black justice if that thing is not appreciated. And so many times what happened is people started to claim victim position alongside a black person by not being a black, but by being something else. The parallelization of this was so gross that suddenly you had to now give space to a historically oppressor just because they happen to inhabit a certain group that is not representative. Representativeness works in a Senate or in elections. In politics, if the oppressed is at the receiving end, they will have to call shots. But suddenly we undermine the oppressed person by saying, yes, but also as a XYZ person, my experiences are also valid. They are valid, but come back later. Not now. That's not your position. And that created a backlash by conservative groups, because that's what they are looking for. They want to attack black people, but they want to identify someone else to attack. That's what happens with the Dalit politics. Many backward caste people in India have a sympathy with Dalits, but they are not having the Dalit experience. So oftentimes, for the comfort of that position, the Dalits don't call out their friends in solidarity, because they are in this moral pressure. Should I just distance my friend who is not a Dalit, but is in solidarity with me, or should I give equal space? There is no equal space. It's an unequal struggle. We are trying to fix unequal struggle. Now, in an unequal struggle, you already want to create a platform of equality to fight inequality. How does that work? You're fighting against inequality. So you have to recognize that there are unequal structures. So when your movement is being formed, you have to imitate that unequal structures to then realize what equality means. You cannot have a utopian vision before the struggle begins. The struggle for utopia is after you achieve that. And that's what happened in during the California struggle against caste. Certain groups of people among the Dalits just obsessively relayed, if you are not this is how stupid it became. And pardon my um, expletives for this. If you are not any corner identity that you could identify with and make a profit out of it became one person centric kind of struggle. And this is very dangerous what happens. So initially they said, usually the Dalits are mostly Maharashtra people who speak Marathi. So are you from, so if you are Maharashtra, you gotta shut up because you are majority. So then they kind of shut up. And they say, oh, if you are a Buddhist, you gotta shut up. So they shut up. If you are from an XYZ caste, you gotta shut up. And then they say, are you a male or female? Or you're male, or you gotta shut up. Or if you're a female, you're challenging, oh, are you a queer person? No, then you gotta shut up. And then it went to trans, and then you said, are you a dark colored person? This is the kind of level of politics against caste. Caste politics and politics of representation are two different things. And the person who were making these arguments were the persons who were profiting from non-profit industrial complex. Because you understand, the non-profit industrial complex is there to subordinate people's movements. You don't want people's appraisal. You want to have a grant-making formalized process of revolution. Who does that? Did Lenin write memos to say, revolution has to come from people's angst. People, poor, oppressed people lead the struggle, right? And for us to really recognize that, we have given undue space for these non-profit industries as equal partners. And suddenly it became, do you speak, are you a Christian? Are you a Muslim? Are you this religion? Do you belong to this gender? Do you belong to this sexuality? Are you trans? Are you not trans? Do you speak this language? Do you don't speak this language? And very effectively, although these struggles are important and we need to carry it forward, but how does that get weaponized to undermine an entire justice struggle is what we need to pay attention to. And if anybody raises a question, the fear of a liberal person is, I don't want to be called out as a racist or a sexist or a misogynist or a transphobic or XYZ. Those struggles are still, we are all of that. We are racist. We have to acknowledge. We are sexist. We are misogynist. We are striving to overcome that. So if somebody gives that accusation, yes, thank you for pointing that out to me. I'll work on it. But let that not become an accusation for us to withdraw from the cause we believe in. The cause is longer. And so what happened in this struggle is university-educated elite kids whose social justice education was given through university, they suddenly started to identify with the struggle for social justice. And suddenly they started to realize that they can make change. And eventually, inadvertently, they started to make their grievance a center point of justice. Now, their grievance is not less important, but what were you there in the first place for? Was it to provide justice to a cause that is plaguing this country since its formation? Or were you there to advance your own interest under the name of XYZ cause that you thought will help you provide a certain platform and create? And you know what happens? It's historic. And this is what happened in India also. All of these people who are non-participant actors, they can go back home and they can retrieve. They are happy, not in the complete sense, but there is a space. But what about those people who, if not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, the cop is still going to point you out? But in the neighborhood you live in, cop might not even be there. That particularity is not clear. And that's what also happened in this kind of struggles that we saw. Neoliberalism, in its essence, I think we have to understand that it's a old model, but it provided a formidable space for emerging capitalist class to find legitimacy when you all know the minority, the small lumpen capitalist is just subordinate, but it gives hope to them that I may also become Jeff Bezos. You will not become Jeff Bezos. He is there to make sure you will never become him, right? But then this is what neoliberalism's achievement is. And what we did is we focused on their wealth to say Why don't we gain some percentage of that charity, use this in the social justice struggle? Some of them have worked, but as a people's justice movement, that has taken time. It will take time. And for us, that's why I say the slow kind of struggle will have its own time to really feature in our times.
Thank you very much, Suraj, for actually letting us reflect a lot on the politics of representability and relationality that you have talked about in your paper. And yeah, as a thank you note, I thank every one of you for making a time, coming here, and giving opportunity to us listen Suraj. And of course, this is a collective reflection and also a surgery of heart sometimes that how do we reflect on our own privileges and sort of partake in the movements of social justice and also be ethically responsible.
Yeah.
Because when we partake in the movements of social justice, we coming from different privileges, even like there are many various kinds of privileges that we sort of benefit from despite being sometimes being a man also.
Mhm.
So we have to be very ethically responsible for that, and that's what you threw light on us. And thank you very much for that. And Amu, I want to thank Austin community for wholeheartedly supporting this event,
Yeah.
and especially Suraj because he came here on a insistence. I can say I can literally drag him.
Yeah, he did. He did.
And yeah, we are excited for your new book.
Thank you.
And congratulations for a new beginning soon.
Thank you.
And Amud, even and we are closing this series has been a great like we started with the Dalit Dreamlands. Manu
What is
Kaur
next? Do you
came,
know the slide?
and now we are closing up with
Yeah, that's it.
So what these kinds of event does is gives us hope to continue fighting the battles that nowadays are being sort of curtailed, suppressed, and repressed. So let's take this hope together and keep the battle going. Thank you very much. I think we still have food outside we can take home. Just quickly wait. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Baba. Thank you, Amu.
Thank you for attending, Dr. Yengde.
Thank you,
Very
Baba.
honored.
Thank you. Thank you for doing. Look at that camera. Like this. Like you guys are like something else, huh?
Stream is